fees on the Missouri River states. Joining me in this bipartisan legislation, Senator John Thune, South Dakota, Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, Senator Max Baucus of Montana, and also Senator Tim Johnson of South Dakota. So it's bipartisan legislation. And in fact, I expect that Senator Thune will be joining me here on the floor very shortly. Also Senator Heitkamp, so that we can engage in a colloquy in regard to the legislation. The Missouri River, of course, flows through the state of North Dakota and the other Missouri River states. So you've got 7 states, Missouri River flows through them. In 1944, through the Pick-Sloan Act, waters in those states were dammed up to create large-scale reservoirs, and there are 6 main stem reservoirs. And of course, the primary purpose for the dams of the reservoirs was to provide flood protection downstream, which we've been doing now for more than 50 years, actually over 60 years. Now, at the same time, just as we're providing that flood protection with these reservoirs, at the same time, the upper basin states throughout the basin, have drawn water from those reservoirs for a whole variety of uses: municipalities, tribes, business and industrial, the whole gamut of uses. And in all that time, more than 60 years, the Corps of Engineers has never charged the respective states, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, any of them, has not charged them for using the water. And that just makes sense. Because if they draw the water out of the river, I mean, every one of the states has water rights, tribes have water rights, so if they draw the water out of the river, of course there's no charge. And so likewise, because the states gave up the land for flood protection in order to create those reservoirs, the Corps has never charged for drawing water out of the reservoirs either. Well, that's changed now. Now the Corps is saying, gee, we're undertaking a study, and in our study we're going to look and decide whether or not we're going to charge a fee if you take water out of the reservoir. So even though we never have, now we think maybe we're going to charge a fee. Well, this amendment blocks that. It says, hey, you can't do that. The states have water rights, just as if they take it out of the river, you can't charge us for that water. You certainly can't flood our land and then charge us for it. Doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, because states have water rights, they'd never be able to do it. If, in fact, the Corps were to proceed and impose those fees, we would sue them and we would win under the law, because the respective states are entitled to those water rights, which makes this kind of an unusual situation, because we've put this legislation forward, frankly, to avoid the cost of litigation, the cost to the respective states, and the cost to the federal government. So the reality is, without this legislation we're offering, it would actually cost the federal government money, because they would have to undertake litigation against the states to impose fees on the states in violation of their water rights, which are well established at law. So this amendment, in fact, in actuality, saves the federal government money. But the CBO, under their scoring regime, says, well, no, wait a minute. Somehow, you know, we're going to look beyond that. I guess pretend that wouldn't really happen. And so we're going to assign a cost to this legislation because you might get the Corps might get some fees down the road somewhere. You know, in spite of all these things, they might get a fee. So they've assigned a $5 million cost to the legislation over the 10-year scoring window. Okay, $5 million over the $10 million scoring window. Well, we've managed to address that by saying no. What we've also added, in addition to the fact that under this legislation the Corps can impose the fees, we've also said, and you've got to find $5 million in savings over the next 10 years out of your operating budget. And since they have just their operations alone, it's $2 billion a year. Obviously, that would be a very simple matter. And the fact is, it's frankly a technicality anyway, because they're offsetting money they're never going to get, so there really is no cost to it. But from an accounting standpoint, we do that so that CBO does not assign any score to this legislation. I think, that's kind of some of the nuts and bolts of the legislation. But the key is this. This really is about states that have given up fertile farmland, thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres, in order to provide flood protection for other states further downstream. They were able to not only use the land, but they were able to draw water from the river as they wanted to without being charged. So here comes the Corps and says, now that we've flooded your land, now that you've provided that flood protection, oh golly, we're going to charge you for flooding your land. We're going to charge small towns. We're going to charge tribes. We're going to charge business and industry, farmers, whoever. It absolutely makes no sense, and so that's what this Act does. It addresses that. It makes sure that they don't impose those fees in clear violation of states' water rights. And in fact, the legislation, even though scored by CBO as having no cost, will in fact save not only the federal government money, but the respective states' money as well. Now, I am very pleased to note that my distinguished colleague from South Dakota, Senator John Thune, is here, and I would like to ask that he express, as a co-sponsor of this legislation, express some of his thoughts as well.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
I asked the Senator from North Dakota if he could just yield for a question. This is an issue which is important to both his state and my state for many reasons, not the least of which is we have, basically flooded 1.6 million acres of prime bottomland, some of the richest agricultural land in our states, in order to prevent flooding downstream. And then, of course, there was also stated other uses, various uses of the water that were to be allowed for the states that were impacted when this occurred. But I wonder if my colleague from North Dakota, he's already touched upon, I think, many of the reasons why this shouldn't happen. But he's a former governor of his state, and I know that our governor and our attorney general have made it abundantly clear that if the Corps moves forward, that they do intend to file a lawsuit, that they will litigate this. And as a former governor, if the now senator from North Dakota could respond to how his state of North Dakota might act in the event that this actually were implemented by the Corps, because it strikes me at least that this is without precedent. This is something that the Flood Control Act, which passed in 1944, and the dams were built subsequent to that now for the past 50 years. Our states have had access to this water, and it's something that is a state right. There is no legal or there's no statutory, there's no historical precedent for doing this. And so I'm just wondering how the former governor of North Dakota might view this as a governor, as to what his action might be in the event the Corps of Engineers were to move forward with this, because it certainly would impact a lot of the industrial users, water users in the state, businesses, tribes. A lot of folks are going to be impacted if the Corps moves forward with this proposal. So tell me again, if the senator from North Dakota might, as a former governor, how he might view this and what he would intend to do, and what our governor and attorney general would intend to do in the event the Corps moved forward.
Yeah. Mr. President, I'd like to thank the distinguished senator from South Dakota for joining me and for his question. And of course, he's anticipating exactly what will happen. The states will initiate litigation against the Corps if, in fact, the Corps decides to implement a fee. Now, they're undertaking a year-long study, and at the end they're going to come back and say, oh, well, either they're not going to charge a fee or they are going to impose a fee, and if they do impose a fee, here's what it would be. And at that point, they would be sued by the states. In fact, in the case of North Dakota, the legislature has already set aside monies to fund a lawsuit, and both the governor, both when I was governor and the current governor and the attorney general have already said very clearly that they will commence litigation. It will be multi-state litigation, and like I said, they've already set aside funds. So that's the point I'm making. We can talk about the CBO score, which we've now squared away so that it doesn't score, but the reality is we're saving both the federal government and the states money with this legislation, because there will be absolutely be litigation, and that's already made clear.
For another question, Mr. President, if I might, our Attorney General wrote a letter to the Corps here, and this is one of the statements he made there. He said, "This proposal, whether disguised as a reallocation of surplus water, exceeds the Corps' regulatory authority and violates basic principles of federalism," end quote. And went on to lay out the reasons why our state would obviously enter into litigation if it comes to that, if it's necessary, in order to protect the rights of South Dakotans to the water that is rightfully theirs. And I guess I would be interested in knowing as well from the senator from North Dakota if, in fact, during the course of the last many, many years, if his amendment would change anything, if his amendment would change anything that is happening today. In other words, today, what happens if a state wants to use water in one of the mainstream dams, and there are 6 mainstream dams, there's one in Montana, a big one in North Dakota, and then we have 4 in South Dakota, all of which were created by the Flood Control Act or authorized there, dams built to protect from flooding downstream, and then also authorize various uses of that water. And I might just point out what some of those uses are. They were to be for enhanced navigation, cheap hydroelectric power, irrigation, programs to increase public recreation facilities, municipal industrial water supplies, and fish and wildlife populations. Those are some of the things that are stated that the water is to be used for. So the Senator's amendment, which would prevent the Corps from charging for this water, as I understand it, doesn't change anything, the practice as it exists today, because a state, or a water user, I should say, would go and request an easement from the Corps, and then the state essentially would have to issue the water right. That's my understanding of how it works today, and under the senator from North Dakota's amendment, if it's passed, does any of that change?
Mr. President, in response to the senator's question, absolutely not. Doesn't change any of the authorized purposes for the reservoirs and for the system. So this does not impact any way any of the authorized uses for the main stem dams, the main stem reservoirs, the Missouri River system. And again, I really want to emphasize that because we've got the 7 Missouri River states. Sometimes we get the upstream, downstream interests. Again, this does not change any of those authorized purposes or how they're utilized or how the respective states interact with them, or even the amount of water usage. So to try to bring any of those other issues in, which typically have been concerns on the Missouri River, does not apply here. Again, this is simply about whether the respective states, and this is one where we can really come together because it's upstream and downstream, whether any of the states are going to be charged for water that is rightfully theirs, and that makes this very much a states' rights issue that all of the states should be concerned about. How can we allow federal agencies to come in and simply impose a fee because they want to? I mean, and then to impose whatever fee they want. Well, we'll do a study, and then we'll impose a fee of whatever size we determine we feel is appropriate. Clear violation of states' rights, and on a very important issue, water rights. And if I could, I want to also invite the good senator from North Dakota, Senator Heitkamp, to join us as well in this colloquy. And she also brings expertise as the former Attorney General in North Dakota and can certainly comment on the legal issues as well. With that, I will turn again, though, to the Mr. President, to the senator from South Dakota, who I think had another question and or comment.
Yeah, Mr. President, again, I want to welcome our other colleague from North Dakota who also has experience as a litigator in protecting the interests of her state, and perhaps she could also comment on what action the states might take if the Corps moves forward. But I wanted to just point out to my colleagues, and I don't know, perhaps you already are aware of this, but I'm looking at some things that are proposed charges that the Corps would make under this proposal. And again, right now they haven't stated, I don't think, explicitly what that might be, but it ends up being a significant amount. In fact, Lewis and Clark Lake, which is Gavin's Point, or I should say Lewis and Clark Dam in South Dakota, they're talking about $174 per acre-foot of yield from Lewis and Clark Lake. Well, as I said earlier, you're talking about businesses, individuals, tribes, industrial users who today have access to water that they believe, and I think we all believe, was something that was promised them when this legislation was passed way back in the 1940s, and that we have essentially now 70 years of precedent where it's been the case that the states have access to rightfully use that water for various purposes as authorized under the legislation, and that this would move away from that and now start to impose these fees, which I think over time could get to be quite excessive. Now, I appreciate the work that's been done by the Senator from North Dakota, Senator Hoeven, in terms of trying to get the CBO to evaluate this in the proper context, and because for a while there they were talking about the scoring impact that was much larger than many of us believe it would have. But again, it's a hypothetical situation. It's not happening today. All you're simply doing is say we want to keep in place the rules of the game as they've applied to the mainstream dams now, mainstem dams for the past 50 years, 70 years since the authorization in the legislation that created them, but also since the dams were built. So I guess I would say to my colleagues from North Dakota, I appreciate their good work on this, and would simply reiterate as a South Dakotan downstream from North Dakota, our states, and I think all the states in the upper basin would be dramatically impacted by this, because it would be a precedent that is something that would be entirely new, something we haven't dealt with literally in all the time that we've had the dams, the lakes in our states, and again, at tremendous sacrifice in terms of the amount of prime bottom land that was given up when the dams were built and when the land was taken. So I guess I would defer to the former Attorney General of North Dakota, Senator Heitkamp, who's also joined us here on the floor, for some observations that she might have with respect to that issue.
The Senator from South Dakota for joining us. He's absolutely right. The cost to the states is significant. The scoring number, in actuality, is reduced because the probability of them getting it is so remote, because they, as I mentioned earlier, they're flying in the face of well-established law, well-established water rights that the states have. So once you assign the probability that they would win to it, that reduces, obviously, the amount that gets scored, which once again shows they are trying to impose a fee where they have no right to do so. So it did create some scoring issue. It really never should. Fact is, the litigation would far outweigh the score that CBO has put on it, both to the federal government and to the respective states, and in the end there would be no fees because there really is no right to assess those fees. And I think on that very issue, we have someone who was a former Attorney General, dealt in fact with this very type of issue during her tenure as Attorney General. And so I would turn to my colleague from North Dakota and just ask her to comment both on the legality of the issue as well as her thoughts in terms of just the fairness and the states' right aspect, which truly makes this an issue that our colleagues should join and support, because this is exactly the kind of thing that could happen to them, too, and could happen to their states. And so I would turn to Senator Heitkamp for her thoughts in that regard.
Junior Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleagues from North Dakota and my colleague from South Dakota. This is not a new issue. This is an issue even back in the 90s that I dealt with as the state's Attorney General. Why do I mention that? I mention that because we were able to persuade the Corps at the time that the intake pipe that they were attempting to charge for surplus water was actually in the original riverbed. And I did, just tongue-in-cheek, a little bit suggest that I was going to charge them for putting their water on top of our water, and maybe they should pay a fee to us for the storage that we were going to allow them. But in all seriousness, I would tell you this is not an issue that is going to go away. If any of our colleagues think that this is an issue that, you know, just let it go, ride it out, this is an issue that has percolated for a lot of years, culminating right now to this effort to be proactive in this body to prevent litigation, prevent excess expense, and really prevent a deterioration of a relationship that is essential to making sure that we have flood protection and all of the other good things that came out of the Flood Control Act. And so the time is now to take an immediate step to prevent this issue from going any further and to address the concerns that upstream states have. I want to just spend just a few moments talking about this from a legal perspective, from straight up what could happen if, in fact, the federal government engaged in litigation with the states. And you've heard today both South Dakota and North Dakota, and I'm reasonably sure Montana, would not let this precedent stand without some pushback, without absolute commitment from a bipartisan standpoint for all the upstream states to push back. So let's talk about why there is problems, legal problems with the Corps approach. Charging fees for surplus water, I believe, would violate a state's right to the water that naturally flows through the boundaries, as historically recognized by the federal government and as recognized by the 10th Amendment. Charging fees would violate statutory law. Section 1 of the 1944 Flood Control Act provides protection for water resources in western states. So we have a common law water rights argument, a historic argument, we have a statutory argument. I think charging fees would reverse decades of Corps policy on surplus water, creating that precedent that should not be established in the upper Missouri Basin, but should not be established any place in this country. And that's why this is an issue that's not about just the Dakotas. It's an issue that's not just about Montana and the upstream states. It's an issue that every one of our colleagues have an interest in reviewing. If you can do it in this case, why couldn't you do it in any other reservoir? Charging fees would penalize Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota by charging for water that's freely available in the absence of the Corps reservoir. If there were no reservoir, there would be no issue here. And in fact, if they tried to charge, most of our colleagues would find that absolutely atrocious. And this is in the face of what we know we have sacrificed for flood control in that basin. And I want to mention here the unique interest that the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, along with Standing Rock Nation, have in what they've sacrificed for flood control, what they've sacrificed in terms of loss of their land, division of their reservation boundaries, division of their property. Now what the Corps is saying, yes, we took your land, yes, we disrupted your natural boundaries, we disrupted your natural way of life, now we're going to charge you for the water that sits on your historic homeland. And it is not...
Request for just, and get
Sure.
the floor right back. I just want to lock in a vote. Thank you. Thank you.
Consent for another 5 minutes?
Well, we have a vote locked in at 5, so you can speak up until 5.
Okay.
It's fine, no problem. It's going to
Very
go
good.
right
We'll
back.
defer. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Senator from California.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that at 5 p.m. the Senate vote in relation to the Inhofe, Barrasso, and Sanders amendments as provided under the previous order, that following the vote in relation to the Sanders amendment, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak up to 10 minutes each. Further, that when the Senate resumes consideration of S-601 on Wednesday, May 15th, it resume the voting sequence in the previous order, with all after the first vote being 10-minute votes and all other provisions of the previous order remaining in effect.
Is there objection? Without objection.
So for the information of all senators, it is our expectation that the Inhofe amendment will be the subject of a voice vote, and if that occurs, there will be 2 roll call votes this evening, and the remainder of the votes will occur tomorrow. And I yield the floor, and I thank my colleagues for their courtesy. And I ask that the record not interrupt my colleague's statement.
Without objection.
Mr. President, if I can just conclude, and maybe we can continue to have the discussion. You know, when you look at water surplus fees and you think about the fact that we've given our land, we've given our opportunity to have free access to our water, we've done all this with the idea that it is for the better good of this country, and now to charge our citizens and to charge people who have always had historic access to that water a fee looks a whole lot like a tax. It looks like a whole lot like adding insult to injury. And I can guarantee you that this issue will not go away. If we don't prevail, what we are buying is a lawsuit, because the Corps is not going to give up. The Corps of Engineers will continue to advance this idea, will continue to promote this idea until they implement the idea, and then we're going to be in litigation. This issue will not go away. The easiest way to resolve this issue in an amiable way, in a way that's going to maintain the relationships and maintain the kind of historic relationship that we have with our tribes, is to deal with it today, to deal with it within the Water Resources Development Act that we're enacting, and to support my good colleague, John Hovins, Senator from North Dakota's amendment number 909, and put this idea to bed once and for all, that the Corps cannot charge us for water that historically and legally belongs to the states where that water is located. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank again my colleague both for her comments in regard to the legal aspects, and again she brings experience, direct experience working with this issue. So I thank her both for the comments in regard to the legal aspect, but also she makes another very important point. This isn't just about states' rights. This would be a taking of tribal rights, too. And I'm going to turn to my colleague from South Dakota and ask him a question on this very same subject. But in fact, in North Dakota, it's going to be one of our tribes that is most disenfranchised by this action of the Corps. Because, again, we've made the point, we can take water out of the river. We can continue to do that. They can't charge us for water out of the river. The only place that they're trying to charge is water out of the reservoir. But most of the reservoir in North Dakota is inside the 3 affiliated tribes reservation. So the people that would be most dramatically impacted, in fact, would be Native Americans in our state. And I'm going to turn to our colleague from South Dakota. I'm guessing that that's true in South Dakota as well.
And I would just say to both of my colleagues from North Dakota that that's an absolutely accurate observation. If you look at who's impacted by this, and we have one of our tribes, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, of course, is partly in North Dakota, partly in South Dakota, so it crosses the state border. Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, Crow Creek Sioux Tribe, Yankton. We've got a whole bunch of reservations as you go right down that corridor, the Missouri River, that would be profoundly impacted by this. And like as we mentioned earlier, when this land was given up, when the dams were built, this was a lot of not only private land, but tribal-held land, which they gave up, and this would directly impact the access that they would have to water that is rightfully theirs. And so in addition to the concerns that our states have and our attorneys general have, we also have a lot of tribes that have a very vested interest in making sure that this doesn't happen. And that's why it's so important that our colleagues here support the Senator from North Dakota's amendment, because as was pointed out by Senator Heitkamp, this is a precedent-setting thing. If they can do this here, they may try and do it someplace else. And I also think that the point that was made by both of my colleagues from North Dakota, and this is a very practical consideration, it will cost the federal government and our states a lot more than what they're saying this is going to achieve in terms of revenues when this thing goes to court. And both the states and the federal government would be locked up, I would suspect, in litigation for some time, and the amount of revenue that would be raised by the fees that would be imposed under these various proposals that are being advanced by the Corps simply would pale in comparison, I think, to the litigation costs that would be involved with this. So that's a very practical consideration, and I concur, and I'm not a lawyer, and I certainly am not a former Attorney General or former Governor, and I know both of you have experience with these issues, but I can tell you from talking with our Governor and our Attorney General, they are highly confident that legally this is a very open and shut situation in case in which our states would prevail and be successful. So it seems sort of crazy in a way that we would have to even go down that trail, and I hope that we can prevent that from happening by having our colleagues join us today and support this amendment.
Again, I'd like to thank my colleague from South Dakota, turn to my colleague from North Dakota as well for any final thoughts before we yield the floor.
Mr. President, my colleagues from North and South Dakota, you know, we come from practical states. We come from states where you try and anticipate problems and you solve problems before they turn into big, expensive pieces of litigation. And that's really what this amendment does. This amendment addresses in a proactive way a policy that we know will not be put to bed until this body speaks. Let's do it now. Let's do it kind of in the way that we do it in our states. Let's be proactive. Let's make sure that we aren't wasting money and wasting relationships on litigation, that we're moving forward to manage the Upper Basin as best we can, and that we do what's right by the people of our state and the people in our tribal governments and our Native American neighbors.
Mr. President, with that, I'd like to set aside the pending amendment and call up the Hoeven Amendment 909, and just close with a couple other thoughts. Senator Baucus from Montana had wanted to join us in this colloquy. The timeline didn't work out, but I wanted to express my appreciation for his support and sponsorship of this legislation as well. I want to again make the point, this isn't about using the water. Our respective states will still use the water. The issue is being charged for it. That's very important so that nobody tries to confuse this issue in order to try to get opposition to the issue. We will still use the water. It's just that we will be charged for it unfairly, except for the fact that, as we said, this would be tied up in litigation, create a bunch of costs for the state and the federal government, so that that wouldn't really happen. So what we're doing is solving a problem, but we're solving a very important problem. It's one that all of the states need to be cognizant of, because if the federal agency can come in and try and do it to one state, it can do it to any one of the states. This is a fundamental issue in regard to states' rights, and if any of our colleagues have questions or concern on it, I encourage them to come to us. We want to talk to them about it. We truly believe if they understand the facts here, they are going to be strongly supportive. Again, I'd like to turn to my colleague from South Dakota.
One final point of clarification, and perhaps the Senator from North Dakota could react or comment on this as well. And my understanding is that this, of course, this doesn't have any impact on the master manual, the way in which the Corps manages the reservoir. And so the degree to which there might be concern about, is this our water versus their water, that historically has plagued a lot of the discussions about the Missouri River upstream, downstream interests. As the Senator from North Dakota pointed out, the water gets used. The water is going to get used. This is water that's either stored or it's used. And I think it's a question of whether or not we're going to be charged. And the users of that water are going to be charged. And that does, of course, create a precedent. And if it's something that they can do here, the question is, what is the next state? Because this violates a principle of federalism, as was pointed out by the South Dakota Attorney General in his letter to the Corps of Engineers. But I just wanted to, for the record, for those who perhaps are viewing this as a battle, upstream, downstream battle, not the case at all. This does not impact the master manual, to my knowledge, and I would, if the Senator from North Dakota would care to react to that as well.
Mr. President, again, the Senator from South Dakota is absolutely right, and I want to thank him for emphasizing that point. It's very important. And again, that's why I encourage any of our colleagues to discuss this issue with us if they have any concerns whatsoever. It is just a fundamental fairness issue, and we ask for an affirmative vote from our colleagues. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection. Without objection, the clerk will report the amendment.
The Senator from North Dakota, Mr. Hoeven, proposes an amendment number 909. On page 190, after line 123, add the following, Section 2060, restriction on charges for certain surplus water. A, in general.
Mr. President, I ask.
Senator from North Dakota. Without objection. Senator from California.
Mr.
President, shortly we're going to vote, I believe it will be a voice vote on the Inhofe Amendment, not a controversial amendment. Everybody agrees to it. And then we're going to proceed to the Barrasso Amendment, which I've spoken about before, which I want to urge my colleagues to be very careful on this one because it has unintended consequences. The way the Barrasso Amendment is drafted, it tries to say in advance of a rulemaking that if the rulemaking includes any information from the guidance that has been put forward by the Corps and the EPA, if it even contains anything like it, the rule will be considered as having been vacated. That's a quote. So the bottom line here is the Barrasso Amendment is such an overreach that we will keep the whole issue of waters of the United States in chaos, and it's in chaos. We received letters from business people begging us to allow the rulemaking to go forward. But because of the way the Barrasso Amendment is drafted, essentially, we are not going to really ever have a rule. Now, why is it important to have a rule that is very clear and explains what waters are covered under the Clean Water Act? Let me tell you why. Without protections of a rule, dangerous pollutants could be put into our waterways. Now, this isn't just hyperbole. We're talking about toxic heavy metals like arsenic and lead. We're talking about toxics that cause cancer and harm the health of infants and children in particular. Who are the vulnerables here? The infants, the children, and the elderly, and those who are disabled. They're the ones that are the victims of filthy, dirty water. Now, I'm not saying my friend Senator Barrasso wants to get people sick. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying an unintended consequence of his overreach in this amendment is pretty clear to all who read it. It says that if the guidance that has already been, the draft guidance that has already been looked at, is included in any way, shape, or form into a final rule, then the whole rule is thrown out on its face, and that leaves the situation in chaos. Mr. President, if I went to you and I said, I want to write a book about mathematics, and you said, that's very exciting, Barbara, but there's only one thing. I'm your publisher, and you can't put one single number in the book. Not a 1 to a 2 to a 3. You write a book on mathematics, but it can't contain any numbers in it. I mean, that's the most ridiculous situation. But this is the essence of the Barrasso Amendment. It's telling people who are going to write a rule that they can't take anything that was put in the draft guidance and put it into that rule. It makes absolutely no sense. And I want to protect people from toxics like lead and arsenic. And without these safeguards of a rule, our drinking water supplies would be more at risk. And the loss of these protections would increase the risks of dangerous floods in downstream communities because it would eliminate wetlands protections. One of the things I learned when I was a county supervisor a very long time ago, that wetlands kept in their natural state and enhanced are the best way to have flood protection. And when I went to Louisiana after Katrina, I was struck by the fact that the whole community understands the importance of the wetlands because they absorb the flood waters. So now, because we're not going to be able to define what is a body of water that falls under the Clean Water Act, we're going to have a major problem with our wetlands. We're going to have a major problem with our rivers. We're going to have a major problem with our streams. We are talking about enormous bodies of water here that are unprotected now because there is no rule. And under the Barrasso Amendment, my opinion is, and it isn't just my amendment, there will not be any rule because if the rule picks up anything in the guidance at all, anything substantially like the guidance at all, it will be automatically overturned. You know, I want to say to my friend, if you don't like a rule, you have the CRA, the Congressional Review Act. Wait until you get the rule. Don't prejudge it. Don't say the rule's vacated. That's pretty dictatorial to people who are in charge of protecting our water supply. Nobody wants our kids to get more cancers. Nobody wants this to happen. We have to protect streams that provide drinking water for up to 117 million Americans. We have 20 million acres of wetlands that provide flood protection, improve water quality, serve as wildlife habitat. So what we're going to do, the hour of 5 o'clock is upon us. We're going to vote on the Inhofe amendment first. Then we'll turn to Senator Barrasso for a moment to make his case, and then I'll have a minute after that. So at this time, we would turn to the regular order. With the absence of a quorum, please.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I call up Inhofe Amendment number 797.
Clerk will report. The Senator from California, Mrs. Boxer, for Mr. Inhofe, proposes amendment number 797.
Yield back all time.
Without objection. The question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it.
Move to reconsider.
The ayes do have it.
Move to reconsider and lay that on the table.
Without objection.
Okay. Madam President, what is the order at this time?
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 868 offered by the Senator from Wyoming, Mr. Barrasso.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this amendment restricts expansion of federal authority to encompass all wet areas of farms, ranches, and suburban homes across the United States. They want to do it through guidance. This proposed guidance that is used by federal agencies, it seems that they're preparing to expand the definition of waters of the United States to include ditches and other dry areas where water flows only for a short duration after a rainfall. This guidance is going to have a huge impact on farmers, ranchers, small businesses that need to put a shovel to the ground to make a living. This guidance will in fact trump states' rights by preempting state and local governments from making local land and water use decisions. I've always believed that the state and local governments, not Washington, knows best how to protect their communities from environmental harm. The guidance does exactly the opposite and puts the power of these decisions in the hands of bureaucrats in Washington. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from California.
Madam President, the way my colleague and friend has drafted his amendment is very dangerous to the process, because what he wants to do is say that if in the rulemaking where we will define the waters of the United States, if they even so much as refer to the guidance that has been put forward, the draft guidance, there will be no rule. And the problem of not having a rule is you leave in place chaos. States can't go ahead and handle this themselves. Local governments can't. Under the law, according to all the rules of the court and everybody else, we have to have a definition here. No one I know wants to classify a ditch or a puddle as a water of the United States. That's always brought up. But that's just a red herring. We need to make sure we have a Clean Water Act that protects the people, protects their drinking water, makes sure they're safe when they swim in a lake. And if we don't move forward with a rule, and at the end of the day, this amendment will not allow that to happen, we're in chaos. And it does not protect our people from arsenic, from lead, from whatever toxin there may be in a body of water. So I hope we will reject this. I thank my friend for offering it, but I really think it's misguided. And I would yield the floor and ask for the vote.
As for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays?
Yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Chambliss, Fisher, Hagan, Heller, Inhofe, Johans, and Vitter. Senators voting in the negative: Baucus, Boxer, Brown, Cowan, Merkley, Schatz, Tester, and Warren. Mr. Casey, no. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? No. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. King? Mr. King? No. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Mr. Pryor? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Rockefeller? Mr. Rockefeller? No. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Coburn? Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? No. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of New Mexico? No. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? No. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin? No. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? No. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? No. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand? No. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson? Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? No. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich? No. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins? Aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp? Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich? Aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham? Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy? No. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran? Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin? No. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen? No. Mr. Grassley, Mr. Grassley? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett? No. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin? No. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Mr. Udall of Colorado? No. Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? No. Mr. Kirk? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Schumer? No. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski? No.
Senators wishing to vote first. Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their votes? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 44. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Move to reconsider and lay that on the table.
Without objection,
Madam President, could we have orders so